Hey, True Crime Podcast fans! See all your favorite true crime podcasters and personalities this fall at Obsessed Fest. We're talking True Crime Obsessed, Morbid, Damian Eccles of the West Memphis 3, Payne Lindsay, Rabia Chaudhry, and more. There will be panels, meet and greets, live shows, and also drag bingo, and even one epic drag brunch. This is not your typical True Crime Podcast convention. Obsessed Fest is happening September 30th to October 2nd in Columbus, Ohio. Visit obsessedfest.com for info and tickets. That's obsessedfest.com for info and tickets.
Hello listeners and welcome to Season 2 of The Cult Vault. As some of you may know, we have now officially launched. For anyone who would like to listen back to Season 1, you'll find my personal journey through cult education taking place from one episode to the next, going from knowing nothing at all to knowing at least a little bit about cults and coercion today in Season 2. Season 1 has some questionable audio quality and a lot of me rambling on, but some incredible guests whose stories are equally as important as anything that happens in Season 2. My aim for Season 2 is that you will find less of me rambling on and better audio quality. If you do find the content interesting or helpful, please consider rating or reviewing the show wherever you listen to your podcasts, or subscribe to the YouTube channel. I also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/thecultvault, where you can pledge to the show for exclusive and ad-free content. All of these links I've mentioned I will post in the episode description. If you're still here from Season 1, hello and thank you so much. And if you are just finding the show now, welcome. I hope you find this content educational. And now, on to the show. Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey and today's guest is ex-Jehovah's Witness turned podcast extraordinaire, Stephen. We talk a lot about his podcast in this episode. Formerly called What Should I Think About, Stephen hosts his podcast with daughter Celine. As of this week, the show has been rebranded and renamed Cult Hackers, and on their Twitter, @culthackers, the term is defined this way. Cult hackers are the people who leave cults, the activists who hold them to account, the researchers who seek to understand how they work, the authors who tell their story, the mental health professionals who support leavers, the filmmakers, the artists, the YouTubers, the podcasts, the new friends who support. So I imagine that there are plenty of cult hackers listening here today. And now, here is Stephen. So hello, Stephen, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today. You yourself have your own podcast that I am looking forward to discussing today, amongst other things. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Of course. Well, thank you very much for having me on the show, Casey. My name's Stephen Mather, and I do a podcast with my daughter called What Should I Think About? ... because in that ... is basically any subjects that we find interesting, really. And we come at it from the perspective that when you leave a high control group, like I did, especially if you were raised in that group, then because everything that you thought you believed, everything about anything, morals, philosophy, politics, your opinions about pretty much anything, is kind of predetermined for you or decided for you by the group. So when you leave, you've got all these questions. And being quite an inquisitive person, I wanted to find out as much as I could about the world and understand it. So I left when I was about 30 years old. I'm now 55, very old. So that's a long time. And so the podcast is really about all of that kind of process of asking questions and trying to find answers. And because my daughter was the catalyst to my leaving, and we can talk about that, then essentially her and I are about the same age when it comes to living in the world. So that's our little joke. And so we kind of come at it from that perspective. So that's the idea behind the podcast. So it's not, we do talk about cults, we do talk about high control groups, and we're fascinated as much as anybody else, but it's also about the making sense of life afterwards, which I'm really interested in.
It must be interesting to discover things at the same time that you enjoy. In some of these environments that we discuss on this show, it might be that you can both enjoy Star Wars kind of for the first time.
I mean, one of the greatest joys that that a parent has is introducing your children to things that you love, and as they become age appropriate, then you kind of can't wait to share it with them. And I suppose a good example is perhaps a film like Clockwork Orange, which Celine went to uni and studied English and media, so she was doing a lot of film reviews and really thinking about film and what it means and all of that sort of stuff. And so I've always been interested in films, but never to that degree. But that we found something we really could get into. She told me we've got to watch it, so I watched it with her and we talked about it. And in a way, that's kind of the proto podcast. That's kind of how the podcast happened, because we've always talked like that. We've always got into these things in quite a nerdy way. So yeah, we thought, well, let's do it as a podcast, with the added, the only interesting thing about me is that I was raised in a cult. I'm quite a boring person, so for me, I had to include that. So when we started the podcast, we kind of started just talking about all sorts of things, and then I thought, you know what, I'm going to have to talk about my background, because that is the only interesting thing about me. So we did, and I like to think it is quite interesting.
You said that a lot of your childhood was focused around the Jehovah's Witnesses. So were you a second, third generation adult? Third
generation, born in, my grandparents were witnesses, apart from my maternal grandfather, but he was very friendly towards it. So third generation, which means that for most people born multi-generational, you kind of end up with your friends as well, family, extended family, cousins, uncles, aunties, and all of that. So it is your world, it's you don't have a kind of separate existence. Like, I guess people who come into the organisation, even if they're children, they might have uncles and aunties and grandparents that they go to visit, and they'll have a Christmas tree up, or they'll have something perhaps on their birthday. But for me, there was nothing, so there was no exposure to that worldly life really, other than the few cultural things that I've mentioned already. You are from a very early age discouraged from making friends in the world. So like obviously you've spoken to many people who've experienced these things, and you've spoken to experts as well. So there's this thing around language is very important, and all these groups have ways of using language, of course, and actually all groups of all sorts do, benign as well as dangerous ones. But the way that language is used within cults means that it is often very isolating, and it is a way to separate you. So, we talk about the world, which might seem like an innocuous word, but the world from a JW standpoint is anything outside the safety of the organisation. So, you talk about not having worldly friends. You don't want to have worldly friends. You just need to have, spiritual friends. So growing up, most, certainly when I was growing up, most Jehovah's Witness children went to school, regular school, although I understand and there's more people doing homeschooling these days, which I think is common across the board. But I think children still go to school. But so you'll have people that you're friendly with at school, maybe somebody you sit next to in the class, and you'll call them your friend. But when it comes to like going around their house after school, and of course the complications are that you don't do anything they do. So like birthdays, Christmas. You're limited really in the opportunities to make friendships outside. So it's very much, stick to the people within the organisation. They're good associates. So again, another thing around language. There's a passage in the Bible that says, in the New World Translation, bad associations spoil useful habits. So this was something that was drilled into us. Bad association spoils useful habits. In other words, if you associate with bad associates, and by bad associates you're really talking about anybody in the world, this will spoil useful habits. Useful habits like being a good Jehovah's Witness, preaching the good news of the kingdom, reading the Bible, studying for the Watchtower, going on the ministry, all the things that actually you're encouraged to do. So you're really discouraged from making friends and from having anybody outside. as a child, I think that's quite damaging, because that means you just don't get any exposure to the world outside, and that is on purpose. That, you know, that is a message that you are given, and I believe that's quite cynical, because we can talk about it later, but that sets up the kind of one of the old 1-2 that sort of keeps you in the organisation even when you perhaps want to leave. Jehovah's Witnesses are very much targeting young people with their own publications. So when I was growing up, we had a book called Your Youth, Getting the Best Out of It. There's a sort of what's the word? There's a way that the rhythm, there's a rhythm to these book titles that you sort of get used to. Your Youth, Getting the Best Out of It. It was a red book, and it was the first time they'd really created a book specifically for young people. And by young people, we're talking about, you know, sort of, I don't know, early teens, or even 10, 11, 12 through to 18, 19. So it was really directed at you, and all this stuff is in there. So all these apparent biblical examples and principles from the Bible that can be applied are, you know, you have to read all this stuff, and you have to study it with your family, and you have to go through it and take it all in. So yeah, it's directly targeted towards you. It's not something that you get through osmosis. It's deliberately targeted at you as a young person.
Some religious groups that we explore on the show, it's expected that the parents will provide that guidance to their children through the understanding of the scripture that is provided to them. But in this way, it's like you can't even push back against the things that your parents are trying to teach you, because it's coming directly to you as children from leadership, kind of missing out that middle step.
Yeah, so actually you get it in, you get the attacks from all directions, really. So yeah, you have publications that are written specifically for you, and you're all excited. Oh, there's a new youth book out. You know, it's the last one was red, this one's blue, and you're all excited about the new youth book that's out. And then I should mention before that, you've got some other books and publications that are designed for the little ones. So my book of Bible stories was the one that was around when I was a young person, but we can perhaps come back to that. So it's basically, you know, you're catered for all the way through your life. So you're getting that. You're also in the meetings, and the larger meetings like the assemblies or conventions, where this hasn't happened for a couple of years, obviously because of COVID, but they get together at football grounds or stadium, and you know, you might have 16,000 witnesses all there for 3 days or 4 days listening to talks and stuff. And there will be individual talks directly targeted at the young people. So that will be, right, you have a look at that one on the program. That one's for you, Stephen. You know, want to make sure you're kind of looking at that and thinking about that. So you get that as well. And then also the organisation strongly encourages families to have a family Bible study, which is something that you will do every week. You'll sit together for an hour or so, where the head of the family, always the dad, will go through a publication, again reinforcing this, telling you about what's required, the importance of bad association or avoiding bad association, having spiritual goals like pioneering, which is committing to a certain amount of hours a month, knocking on doors. Maybe you can reach out for, you know, privileges within the organisation, like handling the microphones in the Kingdom Hall, or selling the books at the back of the hall, or helping to build Kingdom Halls. So you've always got things to do, you've got goals, but it's always within this organisation, and you're getting that constantly. So it's very, very, they've got it down to an art form, really.
You're making me laugh with the way that you're positioning things. The kind of the little overtone of sarcasm is it's quite.
The thing is, Casey, it is quite funny. I mean, that is the other thing that you know, there's a lot of terrible stuff that I you know, we can talk about on our podcast. We have people, sometimes it's hard to stay in one piece, because some of the stories are so horrific, and these terrible, horrific stories are partly because of the way that the organisation is set up. But there's also a lot of everyday bizarreness that goes on, and you have to look back on it at times and just smile, because it is kind of odd.
One of the strangest things that I heard from an ex-Jehovah's Witness when we spoke on the show was that they were punished for either their lack of faith or questioning, and their punishment was that they were not allowed to go pioneering that week. And that to me was the most interesting but bizarre thing, because of course, to me, a worldly person, that's not punishment.
Yeah, you'd soon work that out, wouldn't you? You'd soon work out the way to get out of that chore. Yeah. I mean, obviously, individual parents will interpret some of this stuff, and it is them that are given the job of managing on a day-to-day basis their families and interpreting what's being said. So yeah, I think that's something that I think is really important actually to understand. And sometimes I feel like secular observers and people that try to understand this sometimes misunderstand it, in that everybody's experience will be different, because individual parents will have slightly different ways of interpreting the rules, and some of them will bend those rules as well. So you'll have some Jehovah's Witness parents who will let their kids do things that others wouldn't. So why can't we go out to that party? Well, you can't because well, yeah, but they're doing it. Well, yeah, it doesn't matter what they're doing. So you have this inconsistency, because obviously parents have to make their own minds up on a day-to-day basis. But it's all based on the same stuff. It's just, it depends how the parent sort of responds to it. So yeah, I think that's I can imagine that in the parent's mind that might seem like a good tactic, but I think you and I would recognise that as pretty self-defeating, really. Yeah.
You mentioned previously that you were in public school, and you might sit next to somebody that you call a friend, but they're not really a friend. So is it right for me to assume that you did go through the English public school system?
Yeah, I mean, so in the UK, it's a bit confusing, isn't it, for our American friends. Public school in the US means like the everyday school that everybody goes to. So that was the type of school that I went to. I didn't go to a public school in the UK sense, where it's for rich people whose parents can afford to send them to a public school. So it was the normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill school. I was raised on a council estate, which again for international listeners might not mean anything. This is sort of social housing, really. So I was raised in social housing, and we didn't have much money, and so there's no way I was going to any fancy school, and my parents didn't really like the idea of homeschooling. They thought it was important to actually go to a school. So yeah, I went to the local school, the normal primary school as we called it, reception I suppose they call it now. And sorry, I get so confused with all different changes of these of the names of schooling now. But then went to a normal comprehensive school, we'd call it, or secondary school, which is a high school. So yeah, it's all just normal stuff. But yeah, friends, yeah, again, I made friends at school. I felt like I had friends, but there was always this barrier, because you can't really, a friend that isn't willing to come to your birthday party, for instance, a friend that won't send you a Christmas card, a friend that, I don't know, if you said to them, my mum's died or something, would you come to me to the funeral? Can't do that. So a friend that won't do anything like that, what sort of friend is it? It's hard to see it as a friend.
I suppose it's probably looked at as you not wanting to celebrate the individual, but of course you're not encouraged yourself to have any individuality, which starts from as young as childhood, when these doctrines and these texts are being directed to you as children.
Yeah, I think it's hard to know why some of the policies are as they are. In terms of the birthdays and things. I'm not sure many Jehovah's Witnesses really understand why they can't do some things. They seem like birthdays, for instance. There's not much really in the way of biblical sort of precedent on that. My line was, here you go. So why can't you celebrate birthday, Stephen? Well, because in the Bible, the birthdays are only mentioned twice, and each time somebody got their head cut off. So that was the line I had to give as a child as to why I couldn't.
As a child,
birthdays.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Beheadings casually as a child.
Yeah, well, it was I think John the Baptist was one of the occasions where Herod had a birthday and John the Baptist got his head cut off, and then there's another in the Old Testament where a similar thing happens. But yeah, so it's. But there isn't much reason for it. I think you might be right. I think it could be because you're not supposed to think too much of yourself, and you're meant to not draw attention to yourself. And birthdays are about celebrating an individual, and that doesn't go down well, really. I think with the philosophy of Jehovah's Witnesses, you're really supposed to be selfless and, thinking about serving Jehovah rather than bringing honour onto yourself, which is a bit extreme. I mean, I think a child just having a bit of fuss for a day, it's lovely. Don't take that away from them.
When you were in school, did you have any fellow Jehovah's Witnesses in your school year or in your school at all?
So in the early days, no. So I was a bit of a trailblazer in the school I went to because there wasn't anybody else. And I do mention this quite a bit. Going back to the sort of 70s and 80s, Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe, according to their numbers, is about 150,000 in the UK. Still a very small number, obviously, for a nation like the UK. But being that number, that most schools will have somebody. But in my youth, there wasn't that many. So I think most of the teachers hadn't really come across Jehovah's Witnesses before. So my parents had to go up to the school and have the talk, which is basically, so then, because of our beliefs, Stephen can't. And then there's a list of things Stephen can't do,
That is wild for me to consider teachers having never heard of Jehovah's Witnesses before.
So why can't he do that then? Well, and they'd have to explain it. And, to be fair, most teachers were very good, actually. They were very accommodating. I never felt that the teacher was, angry with me or they tried their best to accommodate. And there were lots of little sneaky ways you could get around things. So at Christmas time, instead of doing pictures of Santa Claus on Christmas trees, I'd draw pictures of snowmen because snowmen have nothing to do with Christmas, really. So you can get around it, and then you're left thinking, Casey, what is the point? What is the point of bending over backwards to try and accommodate this silly nonsense? But anyway, that was it. So yeah, they had to go up and explain all the things I couldn't do, which obviously was the religious stuff, but also morning assembly. I couldn't go into morning assembly because there was hymns sung there sometimes, so I didn't do any of that. So I sat in the library, which was attached, sort of you could hear what was going on in the assembly. I sat in the library on my own, and I was always I had my favourite books that I would read, like the Ladybird Book of Football, the Ladybird Book of Cricket.
Yeah, I love those books.
That's quite boring, but yeah. And there's some other books that I used to read, and I'd sit there for half an hour, and of course, kids would come up and say, what have you been naughty? Because this was the place that you go to if you were naughty, And then, of course, I would rise to the occasion and say, oh no, I'm not coming into morning assembly because I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses. And then I'd get what's called a witness in. And a witness is obviously the opportunity to tell somebody about your beliefs and your faith and try to just sow a little seed there that maybe they'll go home and tell their mum and dad about Stephen who's sat in the library, and they say, why is he doing that then? And that might make them interested so that the next time somebody knocks on the door, they might say, "Oh yeah, my little Johnny's got a friend at school that's why do you do that then?" So yeah, it was all that kind of very weird. I was a very strange child, because obviously you're going to be a strange child, aren't you? If that's the way you're thinking.
It's interesting for me to hear you being ready to witness, even from such a young age, and how we were talking about the idea of individuality and how you are part of a flock, so to speak, when you're in your kingdom hall, in your congregation. But then when you're in school, you're othered automatically when you're outside of that environment, because you're being taken out of activities that other children are taken part in, which kind of puts a spotlight on you, and not necessarily always in a good way for some of the people we've spoken to on the show who have had similar experiences in education.
Yeah, I think as a youngster, certainly for me, you're very kind of fearless, really, and you don't. I didn't worry about that at all, really. I was quite proud of being a bit different, and having this special mission. I talk about this in my podcast on my own story, where I kind of talk about growing up as a witness. But I remember somebody saying to me once, "Don't you feel lonely, sat in the library on your own?" And I said to them, "No, because see this chair next to me? That's where my angel sits." So I believed I had an angel looking after me that was there, So I was completely, hook, line and sinker. I believed it. And I often say that was the time when I was absolutely, if somebody said to me, "Do you believe it?" 100%, 100%. But of course, I was a child. I didn't know better. So yeah, that was a life of quite isolation. But you are encouraged to see your school, or wherever you are, as your territory. So I was able to talk to people that no one else could, because I was a child in that school. They would never get a witness other than my opportunity there that I had. So yeah, that you're encouraged to think in those terms, which actually just put quite a lot of stress on you, because you're always looking for it, you're thinking about it. And of course, if you miss an opportunity, no, I've missed that opportunity, I could have done a witness there, but I was afraid. Then you have to go and ask for forgiveness from Jehovah, because you failed to do that thing that you should have done. And what if they now die at Armageddon because they didn't get that witness? So as I grew up, it actually became a real heavy weight on my shoulder. As a youngster just starting school, I kind of rise to the occasion. But then as I got older, it felt like a huge weight, because it's really serious. If these people don't listen to Jehovah and don't change what they're doing, they're all going to die at Armageddon. And that's going to be on me if I've not told them when I should have done. So I think it's quite an unpleasant thing, really.
You mentioned there that you were in then hook, line and sinker from a young age. I imagine that a lot of people born into the Jehovah's Witnesses just kind of coast through that timeline of significant stamps of events that happen. So what was your journey through the witnesses like? Kind of talk us through that journey, and did you end up with any extra responsibilities in the church, and kind of that whole picture?
Okay, so yeah, I think as a young child, very, very much into it. But then as you get older, it becomes more difficult, partly because of this weight, as I said, on my shoulders. I felt responsible for everybody. But also because as you get older, you start to want to have more friends, and things like having a girlfriend at school, was also like totally out, so couldn't do that. So all my school friends, the people I considered friends, would, Mark's going out with Jackie this week, and he's going out with somebody else, and I didn't have anything to do with that. I couldn't have any kind of these like early relationships that young people, let's say, not children, but teenagers, start to get used to, having a girlfriend or having a boyfriend, or just having somebody special that they hang around with, and generally that's as far as it goes, because that's all that a young person really wants at that point. But none of that. So you start to notice all of that, and you start to sort of see that you're missing out on some of those things. And yeah, so it started to get more difficult, but I still really believed it. And as a young person, wanted to, I had goals to be, first of all, be an elder, a pioneer, which is again spending a certain amount of time. This is more than just the normal knocking on the doors. Pioneering, when I was doing it, was 90 hours a month. I believe it's gone down now to 70 because they've got it easy, these young ones. But we had to do 90 hours a month, and so I wanted to be a pioneer, and did eventually become a pioneer. I wanted to get involved in like building projects, which I did. And my ultimate goal was kind of to become a travelling overseer, and call it circuit overseer. So that was kind of what I wanted to do, or maybe even a missionary, because that sounded really exciting. Going to another country, learning a new language, and becoming a preacher over there. So I had goals, theocratic goals. So yeah, I think you're right. A lot of witnesses raised in the organisation, and some of the people I've spoken to, were kind of very rebellious, and I love that about them. It must have been great to be rebellious, but I was not rebellious at all. I was a real goody two shoes. Probably a pain in the ass, actually, to even other Jehovah's Witnesses, because I was the one that was always the sensible voice in the room that would say, "Yeah, are you sure we should be doing this?" I played in a little band, and we played some songs, and there's some lyrics there that I didn't think were quite appropriate. So I was the one who would say, "No, I don't think we should do those lyrics." And I know that made me quite unpopular. So yeah, I was that horrible goody two shoes example of a young Jehovah's Witness, and that was the future I saw, and I wanted to get married one day to a fine Jehovah's Witness woman who also would be a pioneer, because I only wanted a spiritual wife. And this is the arrogance of it, Casey.
Well, it's just what you're taught. It's what you're taught, isn't it?
It is. But I hear myself now, and it's very. I don't know how to describe it, but I had these opinions about what I was looking for. So, but that was it. That was the way I was. And I liked to be doing the right thing. I wanted to do the right thing. However, I did have doubts, and they plagued me for a very long time. So even as a young person, I had doubts about whether I believed some of the things that I had to believe. So those were my problems. I struggled with some of the early Bible texts around creation, and so Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, a rib.
An apple.
Well, actually, it wasn't an apple. We were told it was a fruit. The Bible doesn't say it was an apple, so we're not going to say an apple. Was it you
that told me this the other day?
No. If it's an XJW, then it's this was something we were always told. We don't know if it was an apple. It was a fruit. That's all the Bible says.
Oh no, it was Dan. Dan corrected me, who I've interviewed before, an ex Kwasi Ubuntu member. He corrected me, and he actually messaged me on Twitter to say it wasn't an apple, Casey. So yeah, it must be.
The man knows his Bible.
Oh my goodness, he just knows so much. So if you're listening, Dan, yes, we're talking about you. It was you that corrected me. It wasn't an apple, it was fruit.
Yeah. I mean, it could have been apple, but we don't know, Casey. So we can't go ahead of what the Bible says. So the witness, we're getting off real off piece here, but the illustrations were always like, obviously you had in the books and publications, there's like pictures of Adam and Eve with Eve tempting Adam with the apple or the fruit. It was always some strange sort of shape because they didn't want to set a precedence that it was an apple or a pear or something. Anyway, that whole story, talking snakes, didn't really make a lot of sense to me. Even as a devout witness, I really struggled with that. It didn't sound like a true story. It sounded like it was made up. Then I mean, don't get me started on creation. The creation story is itself is, well, it's kind of vague and not really in the order that we think things happened, and certainly not in the way we think things happened. And then you've got Noah and the floods, the ark, and building a big chest with all of the representations of all the animals. Getting, how did they get them in the ark and fit them in the ark, and where did all the waste go, and how did they feed them all? And even at that stage, that didn't sound right. And then we get to the Tower of Babel, where the languages were confused. So the answer to why we have so many languages on the earth is because the Babylonians started to build a tower that was so high, it was going to the heavens, and Jehovah said, basically, we can't have this. We can't have this, that men can accomplish anything. So we're going to confuse their languages to stop them from building this big tower. So he basically introduced different languages to the workforce. So, suddenly pass me the hammer was now incomprehensible to this other person because he didn't speak that language. And that's where all the different languages come from, according to the Bible. Well, I struggled with that, Casey.
There's so many things in that are like when they say this is like such a huge accomplishment for mankind, they've built the highest tower that we've ever seen with all our modern technology and everything, and space travel and everything we know about space exploration. How is it possible that in the primitive, I mean, this is just one thing, we could just do this all day, but how is it in the primitive ages, or like, not far after primitive ages, if primitive ages even existed in terms of the Bible, were people able to build a structure that was that tall?
Well, I mean, how tall is the question, so for those people, it was only until fairly recently that any building was higher than the Great Pyramid of Giza. So anything approaching that would have been like, wow, that's amazing. So, it sounded a lot like somebody had written that, trying to explain something that puzzled them. Why are there so many languages? They came up with a story, and it's probably that a lot of these stories were very early stories that people had made up, and they become oral traditions, and somebody then ultimately writes them down. As soon as they're written down, then they become kind of these important works. So, and that's what it sounded like to me. So yeah, and then you get into the Israelites, and they're wandering around the wilderness, and the way that God treats all the people is awful. Basically he says, right, this is the land I'm going to give you. Unfortunately, there's a whole bunch of people living in that land at the moment, but don't worry about it, because I'm going to kill them all, or in fact, you're going to kill them all with my help. So they had lots of jobs to do, like, go slaughtering the Canaanites, and some of the Bible passages around, kill everything, kill the men, the women, the children, the animals. No breathing thing should stay alive, and that's I'd read that stuff and I think, well, yeah, that's really difficult. That doesn't really sit with this loving God that I keep being told. So I had a mind like this, that I would look at all this stuff and I'd think, A, it doesn't really sound very true, and B, it sounds pretty awful. So yeah, I'd struggle with those doubts. Basically, it's a long way around telling the story, but those were the doubts I had.
Well, when you talk about creation and talking animals. That to me sounds like magic. And I'm pretty sure in the Jehovah's Witnesses, you're encouraged to like avoid anything with magic in because it's worldly influences, like Harry Potter, for example.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. There's lots of kind of, I think, just to kind of finesse that a little bit. I think that they don't necessarily say that magic doesn't exist, but what they do say is it's dangerous. It's from, so miracles happen, which is another way of saying magic, really. So miracles happen, and that's God doing things that are supernatural. Also, the devil, Satan, the devil, is able, and his demons are able to do things also that are kind of, they wouldn't use the word magical, but supernatural. So yeah, they do believe in a lot of supernatural things that have happened. I mean, again, all the miracles in the Bible, all supernatural, people being raised from the dead, God stopping the sun from moving. I mean, that was one of the miracles. He literally stopped the sun. Of course, nobody told the Bible writer that it's not really the sun that's moving, it's the earth, but kind of got that wrong. But anyway, that's a different subject. So all these miracles, so the Jehovah's Witnesses do think that it happens, but they think nowadays, if something supernatural is happening, it's actually Satan that's doing it, because God doesn't do miracles anymore, or at least not overt ones. I mean, even that, sometimes they'll have an experience where something happens and like, wow, isn't it amazing that person got called on just at the moment they were asking for help? And they won't use the word miracle, but what are they saying? They're saying that somehow this person got guided to this door when somebody was asking for some help. So again, there's lots of contradictions. This is one of the other problems. But so yeah, I was struggling with all of that. So but I was pushing it down. Pushing it right down.
Well, every single person that we've spoken to on the show who is an ex-Jehovah's Witness have all described these doubts from a young age. So that kind of leads me to believe, in that sense, that everybody has doubts and everybody's just ignoring them, in the same way that everybody we've spoken to about speaking in tongues have all pretended to speak in tongues, and none of them actually believe that they have accomplished speaking in tongues. They just feigned it so that the spotlight would no longer be on them when they were under pressure to be given this gift.
I think you might have something there, Casey. I think you're totally right. I think virtually all Jehovah's Witnesses will have those doubts. And, there are times when people will raise them, and then they're encouraged to pray about it and do a bit more study, do a bit more ministry, go out in the ministry a bit more. And, so you're just encouraged to, one of the favourite things is, there may be something, in fact, the Bible says there will be things hard to understand. So that's code for, again, saying, well, there's some things that you might never really come to terms with. And so what that allows you to do is to say, well, this bit, I struggle with this bit, but I'm not going to stress about it too much. I'm just going to let it sit there on my shelf. So Yanya, our friend Yanya, your friend, has talked about the shelf as well, and this is great sort of metaphor. So you put it on the shelf. For me, it was like a bag with all holes in it, the same sort of idea. And we've collected these metaphors over a couple of years. So you've got these doubts, but you say, well, okay, maybe I struggle with the Garden of Eden bit, but overall, in the main, in the round, do I think this is God's organisation, and do I think this is the truth? Again, language, the truth. We called it the truth. Oh, he's come into the truth. Oh, he's left the truth. This is the way that you talk about it. So yeah, okay, I struggle with that a bit, but okay, I can cope with that. But then what happens, obviously, is that bookshelf gets heavier, that bag gets holier, and eventually, and it took until I was about 30, eventually you start to realise that there's too many holes in that bag. It's not holding it anymore. It's not holding my faith anymore. That bookshelf, there's too much on there. It's now bending in the middle and it's about to break. And that, I think, is the point at which you then have to say, right, either I'm going to do something about that, or I'm just going to live with this agony.
I hate to think of how many people are just existing in that space as well.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, most Jehovah's Witnesses probably do experience at some point those kind of dangerous thoughts. People don't perhaps pursue them because of the consequences that might be at the end of following those doubts, losing your community, being shunned, losing your family, losing your employment, all of the things, you know, that you have put into the group. That's kind of what's at the end of that road if you let yourself go down there. So I can absolutely see why people exist in those environments, but it's so sad to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and it is tragic. It is absolutely tragic. I think Jehovah's Witnesses kill you slowly. I mean, you know, there are some occasions where they kill you quickly. If you need a blood transfusion, for instance, then they kill you quickly. But generally, they kill you slowly. So you live a life out of, yeah, just sort of that routine. You go to the meetings, you go on the ministry, you do some study. You go to the meeting, you go on the ministry, you do some study, and obviously you've normally got some employment. You have to earn a living, so you go to work. So you go to work full time perhaps, and then you come home, and then the meeting or study, and then it's the ministry at the weekend, and if you're a parent, then you've got your study with the kids, and yeah, it's a real kind of hamster wheel of duty and just doing things. So yeah, it is very, very sad. There are people that have grown old and died in this organisation, and people I know, and I just think it is really sad.
You mentioned you became a pioneer, so you fulfilled one of your theological aspirations. What happened after this? Did you get the role of elder, or did you leave before that took place?
So I became, once I got baptized at 16, that's another kind of milestone in a Jehovah's Witness life. When I was growing up in it, that was a normal sort of time, maybe 16, 17, that sort of age. But now they seem to be baptizing much younger. You're seeing people 8, 9, 10, 11, that sort of age getting baptized, which I think is also very problematic, because you're committing yourself to something that has real consequences, which we can talk about. But yeah, I got baptized at 16, and at that point you're then allowed to do certain things that you couldn't do before. So at that point I was reaching out, again, this is another bit of language, I was reaching out for privileges in the congregation. And so the first step on that, the first rung on that ladder, is to become a ministerial servant. So that was the thing that I wanted to be, and there's not much age limit on that, really. You can be a ministerial servant at quite a young age, and this allowed me to give talks on the platform, and even public talks, which normally elders would do, but because I was quite good at public speaking, I got to do that, which was actually great fun. I really enjoyed doing that. Although now when I think about the stuff I was saying, it's kind of embarrassing. I hope nobody's got any recordings out there. I mean, it was only tapes in those days, but even so, somebody might have a TDK hanging around somewhere. But yeah, so I was made a ministerial servant, which was a very proud moment for me and my parents and stuff. And yeah, that meant I could now do more stuff, and I could be responsible for certain things in the congregation, like the literature counter or the territory. So you'd split the territory into maps, and you'd give people a map that would say, right, that's where you're going to work today. You're going to do, whatever drive, Prince's Gardens for you. And so I would be in charge of organising all that. And then I got different jobs like handling the microphones. As I say, the sound system was always a kind of slightly cool gig for us, because you got to play with the mics and the sound system, which was kind of cool. So I did that for a while, and then I became a bit old, as I got a bit older, mid-20s, then they asked me to do the, again, this was quite unusual, though not unheard of for a ministerial servant, but they asked me to look after the second school. So the second the school, they don't do this anymore apparently, but there used to be something called the Theocratic Ministry School, and that was where you'd learn how to be a public speaker or learn how to do sort of door-to-door work, and you'd have little talks. So even as a youngster, I think my first talk, I was about 7 or 8 when I gave my first talk on the platform. Was a Bible reading, and so you do your bit, and then the school overseer would say, "Well, Steve, that was very good. I really liked the way you introduced it, and your diction was very good. Your volume was excellent, and and this week you were working on modulation, and modulation is all about pace, pitch, and power, and so you're varying your modulation, which is very good. But I think you can do better, so I'm going to put you as a work on this point." So you'd have a little slip with either work on, or good, or if you'd worked on it and you'd improved, you'd get an I. So you'd have this little. So it was like a little training process, and I have to say, Casey, it sounds ridiculous, but I kind of loved it, and it was actually quite a good way of learning how to be a public speaker. And so they asked me to be the school overseer for the second school, which was where we'd split out into 2 schools or 2 groups, and I'd have the small one, and I'd have a few people in the second room, the ante room that would be attached to the Kingdom Hall, and then young brother Smith would read his little Bible passage, and I'm reading from Genesis 1, chapter 1, verse 1, and he'd do all that, and afterwards I'd say, "Very good, Johnny, that was really good. I'd like you to work on this," and the other thing that would happen is you'd have, because I should have mentioned this is where the sexism comes in, because it's incredibly misogynistic. Women are not allowed to do public talks or sort of talk from the platform to give teaching. So this is open to men, so I could have fun with that, but I'm afraid, Casey, you wouldn't make the cut, because only men could do that. But what women could do, they could do what Ali Miller recently called on our podcast a little play, which I love that idea. A little play, which is basically 2 women sisters, as we call them, would enact a sort of scene, and it would be normally knocking on the door. "Hello, I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses," and they'd do a little thing, and they'd have a little outline, some scriptures they'd have to get in. So it was my job also to judge that as well. So I would give the Sister Barton, "Very good. I really like the way you did this and that." And so yeah, that I got to do that, which I kind of enjoyed. And from all accounts, people said they liked what I did because I was quite nice to them, and tried to help them to be better speakers and all of that. Arrogantly, as a 25-year-old young man, thinking he could tell everybody else what to do, but I was doing it from the book, so that was where my authority came from. So yeah, that's what I did that, and I kind of enjoyed that. I did stuff on the building, so we had a building project happening, which I was asked to kind of help with, and I did, and I enjoyed doing that. And at this time I also then started pioneering, which meant that I had to give up my job and go window cleaning for 2 days a week, because I had to earn a living. So I was window cleaning, and doing the preaching work then for the rest of the time, and perhaps doing some help with the building work as well.
Okay, so kind of bordering into all of your time is spent around Jehovah's Witnesses.
It's full-time ministry.
Right, wow.
Yeah.
And did you ever combine your window cleaning with your pioneering? Did you ever kind of witness to anybody whose houses you cleaned, or were you like, "Oh no, I can't risk that. I can't risk that income"?
It's a very good point, and you are supposed to, but I think, if I'm honest, I did keep it separate, because you just want to get the damn thing done. I hated window cleaning. I mean, it's a living, and I don't look down upon anybody that does manual labour. I've done it, and I think it has its own honour that goes with it, and I have no problem with that. But it's very boring. I didn't like it, and I just wanted to get it done as quick as possible. So, yeah, I didn't really do a lot of witnessing. It was mainly just, I mean, if somebody come out the back door and said, "Oh, I'm just so unhappy with the state of this world. It's just such a nightmare," I probably would have had to then say, "Well, it's funny you should say that." But I didn't. I think I tended to keep it separate. So it was only 2 days a week. I'd earn my living just doing that.
Yeah.
And so obviously, you don't earn much really 2 days a week. So it was quite. I didn't lead a very extravagant life.
And you said that you were involved in the building side of things as well. Are people paid for this? Because you said that, you've been involved in manual labor, and I always go back to labor trafficking in high demand religious groups and high demand groups alike throughout the world. Whether that's trafficking from internationally, or whether that is labor trafficking from one state in America to the next. You were in England, so were any of you or your team paid for this manual labor?
No, we didn't get paid. I think there was some. So in the building project I did within my congregation, there were some who were professional builders, and I don't know, so I can't say for definite, but I think some of them probably got paid because that was their job. But the vast majority of work was done by voluntary labour. I certainly didn't receive any remuneration. And I worked on a couple of projects. There's another one locally that I really did help to build. I feel like I did a lot of work on that. So in those days, there was something called the quick build, which was kind of a method that was brought across from the States. It's kind of similar to the barn building thing that you see the Amish do. It's kind of similar to that. The process was very much like that. And you'd have to first build the slab, the concrete slab. You'd have to do all that first. And then you'd have a team from all over the country would come in, and so you'd have a team of bricklayers, you'd have a team of plasterers, you'd have electricians, you'd have plumbers, roofers and so on. And they'd all kind of do it in a coordinated way, and then over the weekend they'd actually build the walls and the Kingdom Hall itself, so that the Kingdom Hall would be built theoretically in 2 or 3 days. So I was involved in some of that work, and also in preparing the slab for one of those quick builds that was coming to my city. So I had a very strong connection with that build, and I put a lot of myself into that, and I was kind of proud of doing that. Of course, it's sold now. It's sold to some organisation that has got nothing to do with Jehovah's Witnesses, which is one of the things that happens. A lot of this labour is used to build these Kingdom Halls, which are then sold, and of course all the money goes to the organisation. So I'll let you draw your own conclusions about what's happening there.
What you mentioned there about feeling connected to the work that you'd done, as I've mentioned before, back to things like Jonestown, back to things like Rancho Rajneesh, where you see all of these people coming together to build what they think is the future for their community, for their belief system, and having a stamp or involvement in that project really kind of unites the community. But you said it was volunteer labor. Would you still consider it to be volunteer labor? Because some people have said it's more like coerced labor.
Well, this is a good question, and it's something that I think, it needs to be asked. I mean, nobody, got behind me and twisted my arm and said, right, you need to do this now. But yeah, I think the whole setup is that you are encouraged to give of yourself, and some of that is pretty ridiculous. I mean, I went to, there was an assembly hall. So I've been talking about Kingdom Hall so far, but there's also an assembly hall built at Tellaby in Yorkshire, and this was a beautiful building. And actually, they asked for some brothers. Again, the men folk are called brothers. The women folk are called sisters. This is the language. But they asked for brothers to go and act as night watchmen for this property and the grounds. It's quite a big grounds. So they asked for volunteers to do this, and you'd have to do it like once every 6 months or something like that. So of course I volunteered. I was always ready to volunteer. And so we travel up sort of 80, 90 miles up the road for one night to stay awake all night in this place. And yeah, just basically look after this building. Well, what do most organisations do? They hire security guards, don't they? But not this organisation. They send a letter out to all the congregations and say, right, can somebody come and look after this place? But that's the sort of thing, yeah. So the question you asked is a good one. Is it volunteer or is it coercive? You could argue that it's coercive. I think it probably is somewhere in between, and I think it's I can't think of the word. It's a lie. Basically, you are being conned into doing something. So I'd say it's more of a con. I think that's the word I'm looking for.
Okay.
It's more of a con trick than it is coercion. Now, what is coercive is having to stay in the organisation, and I think that's very clearly coercive because that's done in a very clever way. But yeah, I felt at the time I was volunteering, if I hadn't wanted to do it, I wouldn't do it. Some of the people I knew didn't do that much. I did more than most because I was keen to be a good Jehovah's Witness and to, make it my life, really. So I made it worse, the personality I was. But of course, the reason I did that was because of all the inculcation I'd had, the things that I was told I should do. I try not to use hyperbole with Jehovah's Witnesses or any other cultic group. So I think they are a cult, and I do want to stress that when I say they're not extreme in some respects, like they don't live in a compound somewhere where you literally don't see anybody else ever. So it's not as extreme as that, but I do still believe it is a cult. Yes, it's a cultic group that uses coercive practices to keep people in and get them to do things. So yeah, I do think it is that.
Mm-hmm.
But I was my own worst enemy because I was keen and I tried to do what was right, and so that was what I thought was right.
Well, thank you for answering that question. I think that's a really fresh take on it, and I know that sometimes, especially if you have loved ones, family and friends still involved in a group like that, it can often be difficult, I imagine, to explicitly speak about those things and use that type of language. So I do appreciate you answering that question, Stephen.
I would say, sorry, just to I suppose again try to finesse it even more. I think that things like forcing people to refuse a blood transfusion, forcing people to go on the ministry, knocking on people's doors and trying to convert them when they really don't want to do it. These things, of course, can be coercive and are coercive. But I think I went above and beyond. So I think I was always looking to do more because that was the sort of person I was. But of course, that was because of the lie that I was told. So I think it was a con trick I was a victim of, and that's why I was angry about it.
Sometimes when we've had guests on the show who have spoken about striving for that ultimate relationship with Jehovah or that ultimate spiritual purity that they feel within themselves, but never quite reaching that part because they're having doubts or they're attracted to somebody of the same sex or whatever example you might want to take from any of the episodes we've done. They've spoken about spiritual burnout. So is this something that you experienced, or was it in like a gradual, like, as you said, death over time? Or was there a significant event that was the catalyst for you? I know you've spoken a little bit about Celine and your kind of daughter being born, but was there anything before that moment where you were like, I can't see myself having a future in this organization?
I think I'd have ups and downs, really, peaks and troughs a little bit, where I'd have doubts and they'd become a bit more, the doubts would be louder and louder, and I'd become a bit more disturbed by it, and then again, they're not stupid. There'd be an assembly, or there'd be something that would book everybody up again. Oh, that was the best assembly yet. Really enjoyed that. Great spiritual food, and it's got
spiritual food.
Spiritual food. Oh, have you not heard that before? Spiritual food. Yeah, you get your spiritual food, and you're now nourished again for a while. So yeah, I did go through periods, but no, but I have seen that actually, Casey. That's a really good point. I have seen people who are burned out. So I mentioned about the misogynistic nature of the organisation, and of course, Jehovah's Witnesses would completely disagree with this. They would say that it's not misogynistic, that women are as important as men in the organisation. But everybody has their role, and it just so happens that men's role is this and women's role is that, of course.
And women are happy with that as well.
They love it, that is what they want, and if they don't, then they need to readjust their thinking. Again, there's a little bit of language there. You need to readjust your thinking. We get that sort of thing all the time. The point I was trying to get to was that it is kind of a double-edged sword for the men folk, because whilst they have the power, they also have a lot of the crap as well that goes along with it. So they have to do all the things that they're told to do by the organisation, some of which is pretty unpleasant, really. So things like judicial committees, where they have to make judgments about whether people are going to be disfellowshipped or not. Those sorts of things are pretty unpleasant, and elders do all that stuff. They still have to do all the ministry stuff like everybody else, but they'll also have talks to prepare, parts to do on the meetings. They might have a group that they're looking after, although I don't think that happens anymore, but they have other responsibilities. And so I have seen people who are doing all that stuff and just buckled under all the pressure of doing it. So yeah, it does happen. I didn't feel that really happened to me. I think it was more the doubts that were getting to me. It was more the fact that, again, this bookshelf was getting too heavy, my bag was getting too holy, and I just found that I couldn't carry on with that party line anymore.
Well, you mentioned that when you were doing the second school, you were 25 at this point, and you left when you were 30.
Yeah.
Once your daughter was born. So is it right for us to assume that you met a woman within the Jehovah's Witnesses that you did go on to marry?
Correct. Yes, that's right. So I met Sarah, my wife, when I was a witness. She was a bit younger than me, is a bit younger than me, by about 4 years, I think, 4 or 5 years. So yeah, we kind of met through a relative, a cousin of mine that I'd gone to see, and she was in the same congregation, and I was. So here's it's a bit like Pride and Prejudice, but without any of the funny dialogue. And this is what witness dating is like. Yeah, so imagine the kind of, brother Mather's just visited us. Is he single? Oh yes. You have that kind of vibe going on, and so when you get to a certain age, you're kind of on the lookout for a partner. There is a kind of serious side to this, because you're not able to express yourself sexually in any way until you get married. It means that you've got a lot of, let's put it this way, very horny 20-odd-year-olds all desperate to find a wife or a husband. We've spoken to people who realised they were gay.
Hey, True Crime Podcast fans! See all your favorite true crime podcasters and personalities this fall at Obsessed Fest. We're talking True Crime Obsessed, Morbid, Damien Eccles of the West Memphis 3, Payne Lindsay, Rabia Chaudhry, and more. There will be panels, meet and greets, live shows, and also drag bingo, and even one epic drag brunch. This is not your typical True Crime Podcast convention. Obsessed Fest is happening September 30th to October 2nd in Columbus, Ohio. Visit obsessedfest.com for info and tickets. That's obsessedfest.com for info and tickets.
Which is a whole nother level of torture, which I didn't have to put up with. But, you know, my heart goes out to witnesses who have that to deal with as well. But for us, it was kind of, well, you know, I'm in my 20s now, and I really want to get married, you know, so I need to find a good spiritual wife. And so that was what I was on the lookout for. For women, it can be even more desperate, because there's not much for a woman to kind of aim for in the organisation. Obviously, I'm sure you talk to ex-Jehovah's Witness women, so it'd be better to come from them. But my understanding, talking to ex-witnesses, is that, you know, what have you got? You know, you can't kind of strive for things like I could do, like be a ministerial servant and maybe one day an elder, which I never made that lofty position, by the way. I never became an elder, which I'm very glad about. But yeah, as a woman, you can't do any of that. So what's left, really, you know, finding a husband who could do those things, I suppose.
Well, that's what I was going to say. There's kind of like the kind of unspoken, or maybe even spoken in some circumstances, perhaps, where if a woman can't strive to reach those positions, is the next best thing for her to strive to be married to a man that can reach those positions, because is she then seen in better standing within the organization itself? And if you're not looking to get married in your early to mid 20s, will people then question your sexuality or your orientation because you're not in a rush to pair off with somebody, maybe?
Possibly. I mean, the gossip mill is definitely a thing with Jehovah's Witnesses. So I was never very good at gossiping, and so I don't know too much about how much of that is talked about. But you are encouraged to stay single if you can. I mean, that was another hard thing that I struggled with when I was growing up, which was that there'd always be a watchtower, one a year basically, which you study as a congregation, and often there'd be a meeting, there'd be a part at the district convention which would be directed at young people about staying single. So that was often encouraged. So you'd have a particular talk about the benefits of staying single. Keep your eyes simple was one of the scriptures they used to use. So keep your eyes simple. In other words, try to keep life not complicated. And one of the things that you can keep your life uncomplicated is avoid getting married, which means you can focus on the work. You can focus on the ministry. Whether you're a man or a woman, you know, women obviously can do the ministry, and they are encouraged to do that. They can be pioneers as well. So, you know, that's really where you should be putting your energy. But there is actually a scripture in the Bible where the Apostle Paul says something like, you know, if they're not able to control themselves, then let them marry, which was basically the message that I got as a youngster. And I didn't really want to be thought of as somebody that couldn't control themselves, but I also really did kind of want to get married. So I decided I did want to find a wife, but I thought, well, the best thing to do then is find another pioneer. So somebody that wanted to spend their life pioneering, not really have any children, and you know, we can dedicate our lives to Jehovah together. So that was kind of what I was looking for. And met Sarah, beautiful young woman. I mean, she was only 19 when I met her, so I would have been about 24. So yeah, so again, you are encouraged to sort of you can't date unless you're doing it with a view to marriage. So as soon as you go out with somebody exclusively,
with a chaperone as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we broke that a little bit. We did take the dog for a walk, and we did have a bit of a snog on the corner. Sorry, those people that might listen to this and not realise, but yes, we did. We took the opportunity to have a bit of a snog, but that's as far as it went. We weren't allowed to do anything else. So yeah, we did start going out, and quite quickly, I asked Sarah to marry me, and so we got married a couple of years later, a year and a half later. So yeah, we then obviously do the normal things. We had to find somewhere to live, and I moved town as well, so it was all quite a lot of upheaval. So there was a lot of stuff going on around that, but we still were Jehovah's Witnesses. And then we did decide, although it wasn't the plan originally, that it wouldn't be a terrible thing if Sarah got pregnant. So we kind of said, yeah, let's see what happens. Straight away it happened. So unbelievable. So then, yeah, Celine came along, which was obviously changed everything. So we were already married and being Jehovah's Witnesses as a couple, going to meetings with a baby. But it was around that time when I started to make my decision.
I think it was in your International Cultic Studies Association panel that you did earlier this year, where you mentioned that you had Celine and then realized that perhaps you didn't want the same childhood for her that you yourself had experienced, and that was where things kind of clicked into place. I wondered if you could just talk us through how that happened and what that felt like for you.
As I said, I'd had these doubts for quite a while. They'd come up and down and so on, and so it wasn't like it all just came out of the blue. But I think when Celine was being born, literally, when I do remember being in the hospital room, thinking about this. Part of it was fear and worry about Sarah giving birth, because we come back to the blood issue again, of course. And one of my big fears was that there was going to be some sort of complication, that then we'd have to have that conversation about the blood issue. And especially at the time when I was having my doubts anyway, it was how are we going to deal with that? Obviously it's Sarah's decision, but I would have to, how am I going to support that or whatever? So that I was really worried about that. But then when Celine was born, she's this little bundle that I'm holding in my arms, and I'm thinking to myself, what do I tell her? What do I tell her is the truth? If there's one thing that Dad has to do, it's tell the truth to his daughter. And so it wasn't even the life. It wasn't even, at the start, it wasn't that, do I really want her to grow up with, with all of this religion stuff? It was just, what am I going to tell her?
Wow.
Am I going to teach her stuff that I don't really believe? And it was one thing for me to kind of just bury these doubts and put them on a shelf and stick them in a bag. And it's one thing for me to do that, but it's another thing for me to then go ahead and teach my daughter that. I was a rubbish witness. I didn't bring anybody into the truth, as they call it. So I'm very glad about that. Maybe it's because deep down I have my own doubts. I don't know. But it's a bit different when you're raising your own child and you're thinking, what am I going to teach her? Am I going to do a Bible study with her and tell her that, this is what happened? So that was the catalyst. And I thought about it for quite a while. And in the end, I just had to say, look, I'm going to, and the way I did it, I said, well, I don't know for sure. So it's not like I'm leaving the truth. It's not like I'm saying I don't believe it anymore. I just want to be able to ask the questions and do some research, read things, and just do all that without any sort of distraction. So I stopped doing all the stuff in the Kingdom Hall. I stopped with any privileges, as they say, and just said, look, I'm just going to I stopped going on the door-to-door work and doing all of that. And I just said, right, I'm going to read and I'm going to think and I'm going to make a decision about what I'm going to do. And yeah, that was the moment when I decided that I had to do something about this.
Wow, that's so interesting that you were somebody who would go above the expectations of the average Jehovah's Witness, and you still had that critical thinking aspect of your brain that said, I'm going to stop all activity, because you have to, a lot of the time when we hear these stories, people have had to make that decision, or they've either been forced to from COVID, or, you know, something that has stopped them from being able to participate in all the church related activities. But you yourself said, I'm going to put a hold on all of those things, and I'm going to take the time to see what I really truly believe with an informed decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, I really hoped that I would find it was the truth. So that was my aim, was to once and for all get rid of these doubts, because they've been plaguing me for years and years and years. And I'd been trying to ignore them. I've been trying to push them down. Even on my baptism day at 16, you know, I remember praying to Jehovah saying, please make me believe it.
Wow,
Please make me believe it, because I really want to believe it. And, you know, if he is God, he's not interested in me because he didn't do anything to help me. And I genuinely wanted to believe it, because it would have been much easier to carry on being a Jehovah's Witness than to leave. I mean, now I look back on it now, of course, I'm glad of the decision that I made. But at the time, the thought of just leaving all that, I didn't know, you know, how I was going to cope with all that. It was just a horrible thought. But yeah, so I hoped that I would, yeah, just actually, I've sorted it out now in my own head. Brilliant. I can carry on now.
Wow. So what was Sarah's reaction when you came to her with your findings?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I struggle to remember it, and I don't know why. So I have talked to her about it, and I mean, she's been on our podcast and talking about it, but she was just very, very good. You know, Sarah is a really nice, caring person who was always going to say to me, look, you know, you do what you need to do. But also she tells me now that she never really believed it anyway. Which, you know, so she was kind of fooling me when I thought I was marrying a spiritual woman. She now tells me she didn't really believe it anyway.
It's really a wonderful thing. And you start to wonder about divine intervention when you think about the fact that you're celebrating your 30 years next year, and she was in the same congregation as you, and you truly, genuinely love each other and have this marriage that you've had for such a long time.
Well, I think, you know, I never deny that I feel very lucky about the way things have worked out, and that, you know, compared to many people that have left the organisation, you know, I am in a lucky position, and I completely acknowledge that. Sarah wasn't in my congregation, just to be completely accurate. She was in my cousin's, so I went to visit her, and that's when I met her. So we kind of we met through that process, and that's because, as I said, we were all kind of young people, all looking for marriage mates, as they call it. Again, this language, it's bringing it all back. Yeah, I think we were lucky, although you know, and we have spoken about this on the podcast too, because I'm not saying anything out of turn, but I think we did go through a very difficult time in the early days. So I left first, and Sarah carried on going for about a year or so. And she says that part of that reason was because she didn't want people to think that she was just leaving because I'd left, So it was her decision, and so I respect her for that. And then I think what happened to us was there was a period where we had to come to terms with who we now were and how we wanted to be. And I found it perhaps more difficult. I describe it, and I always use this example. I don't know if it resonates with anybody, but it does with me. There's a song by Talking Heads, and I don't actually know what the song's about at all, and it's not probably relevant, but there's a bit in it where he sings, and I wake up in this beautiful house with this beautiful wife, and I ask myself, how did I get here? And that's how I felt. I was that guy because it was like I had been plucked from nothingness into existence at the age of my mid-30s. Because the guy that came before me wasn't me anymore. So I was leading his life. I'd got his wife and his baby. I was living in his house. But that wasn't me anymore because that guy'd gone. And this is one of the reasons why in my research and my work in psychology, I'm so interested in identity, because I think there's such a battle. There's such a difficulty to understand who you are afterwards. And because of that, I think, we did have some difficult times because we were both trying to decide, who are we? And, we got married because we were two Jehovah's Witnesses, those were our identities then. And what about now, So I think, we had some difficulties and we worked through those. And of course, having a child as well means we had to think about her. And, I like to think we're very happy now. And I look back upon my life with Sarah and I think, I am very lucky. And continue to be so. So, I'm very happy with that. But I think, so I don't want to make it look like it was all dead easy, because it wasn't. It was hard for a while.
You went on to study further education. Did this come after your decision to depart from the organisation?
Oh yeah. So you don't do higher education generally as a Jehovah's Witness. Now you will get exceptions again. So you will every now and again come across somebody that did, but for the vast majority, it's just not an option. So I left school at 16. I did get a job at first, and then I felt guilty because I knew I should be pioneering, so I left that and got my window cleaning round, and that's when I did that. So I hadn't really got any education past 16. That was it. So yeah, I had a business by that time. I was doing sort of gardening type work and lawn treatments actually, and I decided that I didn't want to do that business anymore, and left that. And these computer things are quite a big thing, They look like they had a future. So I started to get into that. I mean, they've been around a while, but I'd never really engaged with computing at all. But I found it interesting. So I went on I did a night class, an A-level computing course. So just one night a week for 2 years. And found that I could kind of understand the user interface end quite well. I was not a programmer, but I was good at kind of just using them, and so got a job teaching people how to use computers. So I did that for a few years, and that was career that I was really focused on. So I was really focusing on career, and that's what I did then for a number of years. It was not until my 40s that I really started to take higher education seriously. So in my 40s, I decided to do a psychology degree with the Open University. And I started that when I was 44. And of course, it takes you a long time, 6 years to do a degree, because it's part-time. So it took me 6 years. So at the age of 50, I got my first degree. Obviously, I was very proud of that.
And rightly so. 6 years, that's a huge commitment. On the Open University, you have to be so disciplined as well, because often, like cults, sometimes universities create this insular environment, where you live on campus or you live nearby and you live with people that are, also attending the university, whether that's your course or a different course. So to have that discipline to study outside of that environment for 6 years and get that degree as a mature student, that is a huge accomplishment.
Yeah, I mean, I was very happy to do it, and I enjoyed doing it. It was a subject I was interested in. But at the same time, I was also trying to develop my career. So as I said, I went into IT training and then ended up working for an organisation in their IT department for a food manufacturer. Was in their IT department, and then 2008 happened, which was when the big financial crash happened, and I got made redundant from that position. But they wanted me to do another role, which was kind of working for what they call the manufacturing excellence team, and that involved doing things like management training and coaching, and also lean manufacturing and all that technical stuff, which I found quite interesting. And there's moments in your life when you realise that this is a real opportunity. Don't muck it up, And at that moment, I thought, I need to grab hold of this with both hands, because this is the moment I can really get motoring with my career. So I hadn't done my degree by this time. I was still thinking about it. I thought about it for a long time, but so I was really focusing on career. So I did that for a few years, and I headed up a little team, and then more stuff happened, and I got made redundant again. This time, we all got made redundant. So I set up my own consultancy in training and coaching and in manufacturing stuff, and which is essentially what I still do now. I was really trying to build a business, a consultancy. I also had an idea about how business or how improvement should be done in the workplace. And I had this idea for how I could help businesses do it. So I was trying to develop that idea as well and sell that to people. And then I decided to do, I got made redundant from this company, and then set up my own thing and trying to develop all that. Then did my degree. So yeah, it was incredibly busy, and there are times there where I think I sort of neglected the family a little bit, because I got a bit focused on the career. But that was partly because I just felt like I was trying to make up for lost time. So I was really trying very hard, and I have had moments of, whether you call it burnout, I don't know, but I've suffered from some parts of depression during those periods, because I was working so hard to try and catch up, doing so much, doing the degree as well, that I have had periods where I've kind of lost the plot a bit, I think.
Do you feel like with you doing all of those things simultaneously, do you feel like you're maybe trying to prove a point to yourself or others who may have had thoughts about you as somebody that is an ex-Jehovah's Witness?
I think there's a big part of that, and I think part of that is that I also wanted to prove to everybody that I left behind that, see, which is pretty pathetic, really. And I don't
think it is. I don't think it is at all. I don't agree with that in the slightest. I think it's got to be one of the most, well, people have said it's the hardest thing they've ever done is to walk away, because of all of those things we listed around the consequences of leaving. And it is slightly different with the Jehovah's Witnesses. And I think that's a huge thing to be able to move on, to, you know, when you're third generation, as you said, it's such a self-sealed system. You've moved out of that and you're creating a life that's completely separate to the Jehovah's Witnesses. How do you build that? You need financial stability as one part of that. You want your independence and your individuality, as you've mentioned, kind of making up for lost time. So I don't think that it's pathetic in any way. I think it would be completely natural, which is why I asked the question, you know, if that was one of your motivating factors, was to be like, I can make a life without everything that was given to me as a Jehovah's Witness.
I think it's a great question, but you're absolutely spot on. But I think I probably took it too far in a way that wasn't necessarily good for me, because I don't think I realised when it was enough. You know, when is it enough to say, you know, that's it now?
But that's exactly what you were like as a Jehovah's Witness as well. Don't you think that's
Probably.
Interesting?
Yeah. No, it's true.
Wow. So do you have a moment where you thought, this is not sustainable, I need to really reflect on how I do things?
Yeah, I think so. And a few things, I suppose, have happened. One is I've got a bit older, so your energy levels start to decrease, I think, when you get into your 50s. I don't know. Yes, I think partly I've become a bit more willing to say, you know, let's be a bit more reasonable about what I can achieve. And that's not to say that, you know, there's not more I can do, and I do have ambitions for the future, and there's things that I'd like to do, and I've even thought about doing a PhD, which I keep thinking about again. I have thought about writing a book, which, you know, I think there's niches there that I do believe I could contribute to, and so I've thought about that. So I've got lots of things that I'd like to do, but I think there's certain things that I can say to myself, look, you know, I'm actually quite happy doing what I'm doing. And I mean, part of that has been quite recent. So with the podcast, so part of that is the pandemic, and spending a lot of time at home, and we started the podcast, and so I do a lot of work now that I just simply don't get paid for. It's just completely labour of love. I'm sure you understand that. And also having a voice, you know, being able to talk at the International Cultic Studies Association thing, that was a massive honour for me. Never thought I'd be able to do that. And I'm now talking to people like you and others who I've actually made a lot of friends and people that I really value, these relationships that I've been able to build, and actually that's overtaken a lot of the kind of raw ambition that I had for the business. You know, it has to be the business. So, you know, I think I've come to terms with quite a lot of that, and I'm actually happier now than I've been for quite some time. Wow. So yeah, I think that's part of it. I've just finished my master's.
Yes, I was just about to ask you about that. Yeah, I love that you can identify now that that it's not all or nothing with one thing. And I think actually maybe I could take a lot away from what you're saying there as somebody that's managing not just one project, but a few different things in life, and like you said, family is so important as well. So it's really interesting for me to listen to you talk about that from your perspective. But to do a PhD, you do need a master's, so you must have a master's, so please tell us.
Yeah, well, I did a master's in organisational psychology, which at the time I thought I was doing it. I thought I chose it because I'd already got my degree in psychology, my BSc, and so it seemed like psychology, what's the next step? And the fact that I was doing management training, business improvement, culture change, behavioural safety, these are all things that I was doing already. And I thought, well, organisational psychology sounds like a good fit, so let's do that. There's a little voice in my head that thought, sort of organisations interesting. There might be some, because we used to call the Jehovah's Witnesses the organisation, and I think they still do. It's the organisation, So there's a bit in there. And then as soon as I started to do the degree, the very first module was all about the idea of a calling. So like a calling in the workplace. So like, and it was nothing to do with religion really, but this word, this calling. And actually I took quite against it. I got the hump really about it, because I thought, this is really, what we doing introducing religious terms into a scientific master's degree? What's that got to do with anything? But what it kind of did was make me realise that, firstly, what's wrong with you, Stephen? Why are you getting annoyed about all that? There must be something going on there. And secondly, was that actually this subject of organisational psychology, this could be applied to cults.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, was there a module on like group behaviour and group organisation and hierarchies and things like that? Wow.
Yeah, loads of that. So there's lots of stuff around, motivation. So think about what cults do, and then think about what other organisations do. So what we were learning was things like recruitment, maintaining, so people stay in the organisation, motivating people, charismatic leadership, transformational leadership, culture change. These are all things that
they could have labelled it like how to start a cult.
Exactly.
Wow.
And a lot of it was really interesting. Obviously, because of my career, it sat very nicely with what I was doing in my job, but there was also this other part of me that was thinking, and the other thing that I started to notice was no one else is talking about this stuff. So no one else in the cultic world that I saw was kind of even mentioning any of these papers that I was reading, or researchers that were talking about motivation theory or self-determination theory, and all these sorts of ideas that have been around for years in organisational psychology. Nobody's mentioned them, as far as I can see, in any of the books that I've read about cults. So I was thinking, why not? Why are we not using this stuff? And I'm still asking that question, because as far as I can see it, there's still nobody talking about that. There is an academic called Dennis Turish that I did a little series of podcasts that will be coming out in October, I think, with actually somebody that I met at my master's, who has a podcast called The World of Work. So I collaborated with her and her business partner, James. She's called Jane. And we do talk about some of this crossover, because I think it is really important. But there's a guy called Dennis Turish who I do want to reach out to, because he is also an organisational psychologist, and he has a bit of a problem with transformational leadership, which is, again, this area of charisma and so on. So there is a bit of crossover, but I think there's certainly in the main forums of discussion, there's not much.
No.
There's not much cooperation, I don't think, between these different disciplines, which I think could be really interesting.
What you've just said there makes me want to ask you around, when you teach on these courses, as an improvement coach, how do you make sure that you don't step over into that territory? Because the self-help and new age era is really rife at the moment with these types of leaders. How do you identify that and make sure that that's not something you or your employees branch into?
Yeah, I mean, it is I think it's a danger, and it's something that only, I think, over the last sort of 3 or 4 years have I started to really engage with that question. I think what one of the problems is that actually a lot of the things that good, fine, progressive consultants try to do is, let's say, things like make work more meaningful for people. So who wants a transactional relationship, which is basically just going to work, doing your job, getting paid, and then coming back the next day, and that's it. So you can leave your brains at the door, because you don't really you don't really care about it. You just got to do it. And so a lot of enlightened organisations want to make work interesting, and they actually want employees who are enthusiastic, motivated, give of themselves. You get into this area of emotional labour, which is this idea where you give of yourself, and your feelings and emotions become part of the thing you're doing for the workplace. And actually this is seen as a good thing. But lurking in there is a real risk that actually what you're creating are exactly the same sorts of conditions that you get in a cult. And there have been some high profile examples. So I have to be a bit careful because I think it's changed a bit now, but you may have seen the debacle that was WeWork. There is a television series about it. There was a film about it. There's been books about it. There's a really good podcast by Wondery about it. And, this guy told everybody that, what was your mission? We're going to change the world. The guy's selling spaces, selling desk space. That's what he does. But he actually believes he's changing the world. And this whole ethos around, it's not just we work, it's we play, it's we teach, it's like this whole idea of we, and it's, and then they're building places to live basically within this environment. And so it's very easy with a kind of charismatic leader with a desire to make work meaningful, and it is a risk, and I think we do have to be careful of it, and I think about it a lot. And I think the first thing you have to do is be aware of it and be careful. And there's things that I've thought about myself in the cold light today. I think to myself, what were you thinking? So it's very easy to slip into a kind of cultic type mindset.
Yeah. But that in itself, I think, is really, really interesting to when people pose the question, did Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh know where he was heading when he started, when he would have a few followers around him and then establish the ashram and so on? Did he have a final vision? Did he set out to, abuse young women? Is that like, by promising enlightenment in this pyramid system? People ask those questions all the time. Did Jim Jones always know, where he would push his followers to? And I think what you've just offered there is the answer, probably not.
Yeah, I mean, it is quite frightening that could have come out of my head, and it was only really through doing the work with that I've done on cults that really made me realise when I look back at that and thought, ooh, yeah, that. And also there were other experiences I had with kind of boutique consultancies, which I won't name, but that one of which, I mean, I've got this idea called that I've just made it up. So, or unless somebody else has come up with it first, in which case I'm sorry, but I call it a proto cult. I think there are a lot of proto cults out there, which are kind of groups that kind of could move into a cultic, full-blown cult.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of them don't quite make the grade, but they could.
Wow.
So I think there's kind of a lot of those sorts of groups, and a lot of it is around, again, charismatic leadership, meaning and purpose, a workforce who is very dedicated, who really want to please the boss, and also to think they're going somewhere. This is the road ahead, and I want to be on it. It's that sort of missionary type zeal. So I think we just have to be a bit aware of that stuff, and we're probably not quite aware enough, I think.
This type of thing is what really interests me, and I am just so thankful that you're willing to answer these questions, because some people might not be willing to say, well, there was a time where I did have to question what I was doing, and laugh about it as well as you're doing now. But I think insight is one of the transferable skills that a lot of individuals gain from one of the positive things that a lot of individuals gain once they have moved away from a high demand group. So before we move on to the last segment, which is to kind of talk about your panel at the ICSA conference, your podcast and where people can find you and all of that great stuff that I really want to make sure we get in before the end. I wondered if you could just talk us through what some of the more extreme doctrines are within the Jehovah's Witnesses.
I think some of the things you mentioned are essentially results of the policies and the beliefs. So, for instance, the two-witness rule relates to the whole judicial committee and the disfellowshipping processes. And I think there's got to be questions about, how do we end up there? And I've actually talked about this on a blog that I tried to grapple with, how do we end up with disfellowshipping? How do we end up with shunning? So I can talk about that, but I think that's more of a symptom. The big problem with Jehovah's Witnesses is that they take a literal, or at least in parts, a literal interpretation of the Bible, but it's them that do the interpreting, and so they believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God from Genesis through to Revelation. So as a kind of come from the Protestant tradition, I suppose, they take 66 books of the Bible and they say they are literally the word of God. Although men might have written them, it was God who inspired that. So it's God's word. Everything in that Bible is 100% true. So things like morals and what's right and wrong, those sorts of things, are that they use the Bible as their guide for that unashamedly. This is not controversial, they would agree with this. Now obviously, because of the nature of the way the Bible is written, you have to interpret what some of these things mean, and there's differences of opinion about the appropriateness of applying certain things to certain situations, but that's what they do. But I think the deeper problem is that they think that a book written thousands of years ago can actually tell us how to lead our lives in a very specific way. So not just in a philosophical way, So if it was really about love your neighbour as yourself, turn the other cheek, golden rule, do unto others, all that stuff, that's fine. But when you're talking about making decisions about things like sexuality, or how to treat women and how to lead a family life, and these are things that are inappropriate, in my view, for the Bible to be telling us how to do it. But because they think it's the word of God, they would say, well, this is God's wisdom. You're only a man, what can you know? God's the one who tells us what to do, and it's in his word, the Bible. Because they get to interpret what that means. So that's the biggest problem.
The Jehovah's Witnesses as a faith is based on the interpretations of it. Is it Charles Taze Russell?
Well, he was the person who started it. But to be honest with you, a lot of what he said, Jehovah's Witnesses no longer accept.
Well, this is what I struggle with when I try to understand some of the teachings and some of the really hardcore rules within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Natalie Grand, who is the author of the graphic novel Cult Girls, she tweeted something the other day about how Jehovah's Witnesses eat meat off the bone, but they'll never change the blood doctrine because too many people have died from rejecting blood transfusions. So that's kind of what I struggle with when I try to understand the faith, because they have changed parts of the interpretations that were originally in place by the founder.
Well, yeah, I mean, as far as I'm pretty sure that Russell had nothing to say about blood transfusions, as far as I know. I mean, They also celebrated Christmas. Charles Taze Russell thought the end was going to come in 1914, along with others. So yeah, I mean, it started then, but Jehovah's Witnesses have this term called New Light. We even had a little song about it, about the increasing light. The light gets brighter, and this is a philosophy that basically means you can change your mind because it's increasing light. So the idea is that the Bible is always true, but as the governing body, who are the ones that the leaders who make the decisions about how to interpret the Bible, they will receive increasing light, so they understand things better as time goes on. There's this other, I mentioned about spiritual food before, and they use this scripture about having food in its proper time. So, maybe we weren't ready for that truth then, and now we are. So now it's ready. Now we're ready to know this new truth. So it doesn't really stand up to much scrutiny, because obviously some of these things are quite... when I was growing up, I was told and I told others, because that was what I had to do, that the end of this system of things, which is another extreme thing to answer your original question, that the end of this system of things, in other words, Armageddon, would come before the people that saw 1914 have died. So Jesus said to his disciples, when he was talking to them about the destruction of Jerusalem, that this generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur. Now, because Jehovah's Witnesses take his prophecy about Jerusalem and they apply it to 2,000 years later, to our day, they apply that bit as well. Well, they did. So that meant that people that saw the signs of the times, and that started in 1914, that some of those people that saw that would be alive before the end would come. There would still be some people around who would see it. And that was what I was told over and over and over and over again. And that is what I preached from door to door. And that was one of the reasons why I left, and I remember saying to somebody, you made a liar out of me. And that was one of the few times when I did kind of get a bit angry about it, because they made a liar out of me. And so, yeah, but now the doctrine is that the generation can actually refer to more of a kind of, what was the word? These are people who are around the same time period. So this actually is an overlapping generation. So it's the generation now that knew some of those people who saw 1914 will still be alive. That they think the world is going to be destroyed by God. He's going to destroy 8 billion people, and those basically not Jehovah's Witnesses, a good proportion of which, by the way, will have never ever heard of Jehovah's Witnesses. If you happen to live in China, which is and a large portion of India as well, and Pakistan and the Middle East, you will never have heard of a Jehovah's Witness or what they believe. What it comes down to is what I said before, really, is that it's the fact that you think that the Bible is the inerrant word of God and that what it says we have to do. And as soon as you say that, you are running a risk of believing all sorts of strange things and doing strange things, because of course we live in a different world now. They had no blood transfusions back in the days of Bible times. The big problem is that they're using the Bible as the way to make decisions about what they do in their lives, or at least these group of men are saying what to do.
What about the shunning process? Because that is something that it's not unique to the Jehovah's Witnesses, but it's pretty severe within that organization.
How we've got here with shunning is again based upon a Bible passage. I think it's the Apostle Paul. So the letters that you see in the Bible, like the Ephesians and Philippians and Galatians and all these are letters that were written to congregations by the apostles, basically. And in these letters, they talk about all sorts of kind of things that you should be doing, you shouldn't be doing. These are early Christian writings. One of the things that, I'm sure it's the Apostle Paul, please forgive me if I've got this wrong, but one of the things that he says is that we don't judge those outside the Christian congregation, but we do judge those inside. And then he talks about people doing things like being a drunkard, being an idolater, being an extortion. I think extortion's in there, maybe not. A reviler, which is a great word that nobody knows what it means. Certainly, I never met anybody that was disfellowshipped for being a reviler. And these sort of what they would call gross sins, he says basically to quit mixing with any of those people. So basically, don't have anything to do with them, not even eating with them. So they take that scripture, which was a letter to the congregation where people would essentially make up their own mind about these things. But they take that and they say, all right, this is actually what the Bible says we should be doing in the Christian congregation. But it's not up to the brothers and sisters in the congregation to make those decisions, because we've got this system of elders within the organisation, within the congregations. Actually, it's them that have to make this decision. But now, as soon as you do that, you're creating a kind of bureaucratic admin that was never talked about in the Bible. So there were no judicial committees. There was no disfellowshipping. These are modern inventions that are designed so that the elders can make decisions about whether Anthea should be disfellowshipped or not for what she's done. Now, as soon as you start doing that, you come across all sorts of challenges. Well, what if she's not married, and what if he's not married? Does that count? And what if they're engaged, actually, and how does that work? And actually, what it's really about is repentance. So it's not so much what they did, it's whether they're sorry about what they've done. So how do we work that out? How do we know if Anthea is sorry about what she's done or not? Well, we have to come up with some ways of understanding that. So let's ask her about whether she planned it or not, or whether she told anybody afterwards, or so. Then you start to have the need of a book that the elders can look at and say, right, how do we do this then? Well, okay, well, these are the things that you do. Hence the need for a special elders book called Shepherding the Flock of God, which basically means that you've got a rule book now that you can use. But the congregation don't see that book. So they don't know. They know what you can get into trouble for, but they don't know the process of how all that's going to work out and how you're going to show that you're repentant or not. So once you've gone down this road and you've now got this bureaucracy that is making these decisions, you've now got elders basically deciding who gets to be disfellowshipped or not.
Yeah.
You end up with mostly middle-aged white men, certainly in the UK, interfering in people's lives quite deeply. But it is, again, so you see lots of people disfellowshipped for things like adultery or fornication, but I've never heard of anybody get disfellowshipped for reviler or glutton. The glutton is in there. I'm sorry, but there's lots of fat Jehovah's Witnesses, but nobody's ever been disfellowshipped for gluttony as far as I know. Why is that? Why has nobody ever been disfellowshipped for being a reviler? Because there's a lot of people that are quite nasty. Why are they not getting disfellowshipped? So it's very selective. It's, well, I think this is the thing that we're going to focus on. And it tends to be a lot about sex. So if you're gay, and you realise that, you basically have two choices. You either leave and probably get disfellowshipped, or you have to suppress your sexuality for the rest of your life. And probably get married as well. So that's the other thing that often happens, because, you're just expected to get married and trying to be somebody you're not. It's basically the same argument every time. It's God's view about it, and we know that because it's what the Bible says. So there is always a passage of scripture that is used to explain that position, and sometimes they are stretching it, and sometimes they're actually reflecting the prejudices of people 2,000 years ago who were writing this stuff down. So yeah, but that's the reason why they would say they do anything. And just to be fair, like I always try to be, I think the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses hate the disfellowshipping thing. People were very interested in the Australian Royal Commission, for instance, and that has been cited by so many people we speak to as the time when they really started to have doubts about the organisation, which shocks me a little bit because it seems so recent to me. And I automatically think people have been left a long time, like I have. But yeah, people have. Some people we speak to have only been left a couple of years. Wow. It's important to make the obvious statement, which maybe it's too obvious, but the vast majority of Jehovah's Witnesses would be absolutely horrified about what's been happening. And the organisation itself is not kind of designed to give cover for these sorts of activities. I think it's, though, because of like you said, that because of the way it's structured, not least the fact that men within families are essentially untouchable and in lots of ways, and because they are seen as the head of the family, the spiritual head, might often be mates with the elder who's in charge of any sort of accusation against him, then I do think it makes women and children vulnerable if that man is of a certain disposition, let's say, either physical abuse or sexual abuse. The fact that everybody's called brothers and sisters, uncles and aunties, also loosens some of those kind of barriers between people. So I had loads of uncles and aunties in the congregation, and everybody was uncle so and so or auntie so and so, and you just didn't even imagine that anybody would do anything like that. I was never a victim of anything like that personally. And then you have the other things like the two witness rule, this idea that you have to have two people to testify about an act like that. It cuts across all common sense, but again, it's because it's an interpretation of a particular scripture in the Bible. Should we be making our decisions about protecting children from sexual abuse through a book that was written thousands of years ago? No, of course we shouldn't. So that's, again, we're back to that problem again. We're back to that. This is why I say these are symptoms of the big problem, which is that they are taking the Bible literally and interpreting it as if it is giving us instructions for how to lead our lives now, and even down to the way that the local congregation is administered by men within the congregation. And that is the reason. They don't see the jurisdiction of the law. And I have to confess, I have no inside knowledge on any of this stuff. It was never an elder, so I was never involved in any of the how to deal with this stuff. So I am speaking from my understanding of what other people have said. But I think, from the latest Call Bethel podcast, for instance, with the Telegraph investigation, and there's plenty of biographies about this sort of stuff, I think it's pretty clear that there's still a long, long way to go.
So, just before we finish, can you tell us what your panel was titled for the International Cultic Studies Association this year, what the main themes of the panel were, and then also where people can find your blog and your podcast with Celine?
Right, absolutely. So my presentation was called University Changed Everything, Finding Identity After Leaving Jehovah's Witnesses. I think that's what it's called. It's an academic paper, I had ambitions of it being an academic paper. It was my dissertation. So yeah, it's that sort of title. But basically, it's about how people made sense of their lives after leaving Jehovah's Witnesses and coming to terms with their new identity, or their identity as an individual after Jehovah's Witnesses. so that was it. It was a qualitative piece of work that I presented at the ICSA conference. So I just sort of summarised that bit of research and talked about it.
The panels are available until September on the Hoover app, where the conference took place virtually. But are you allowed to share them like personally? Is that allowed if anyone was?
But I don't mind people hearing my my presentation, but I think technically you're supposed to keep it to the attendees who were there. But
Well, if anybody wanted to learn more, then they can reach out to you or me, and we can let them know what that was all about.
What to do. Just to summarise it, I mean, basically, what I found with my participants in the research was that they used career or education. These particular participants used career and education or education as a way to make sense of their own identities, and they were able to sort of identify that although it felt like they were a new person, that there was enough of their kind of core identity that they could identify from even when they were a witness to afterwards. And that's this job, that's this work we have to do when we leave, is to try to make sense of who we are. And it is an area that I'm quite passionate about, because I think sometimes the impression is given that we have this pseudo identity that wasn't really you, and now you have to find your core, your true identity, or authentic identity again. And that might work for somebody who was brought into a cult, but for somebody who's born into it, it feels very daunting to imagine that everything that you were has now gone. Like that Talking Heads track I was talking about. I had to come to terms with the fact that actually it was still me. That guy was still there. It is still me. I've actually got still a lot of those qualities, like you mentioned. I tended to be a bit overdo it. I still overdo it a bit. I was a bit oversensitive. I'm still a bit oversensitive. These are certain elements about me. And what my research suggests is that people need to find a way to create this continuity of identity by finding things that they can make sense of. And so one of my participants was a really funny guy who loved to give talks on the platform. Then when he left, he became a stand-up comedian, and he was able to identify that actually he always liked to make people laugh, and he liked to be, up there, kind of the centre of attention. That was part of his personality. So that helped him. So that's kind of that's the main part of it, really.
There is a lot of talks around how there is a lack of research in comparison to that exists in terms of adults that convert or join a group later on in life. So it's incredibly important that panels like this exist and take place, and that people are deciding to use their opportunities to generate research papers that focus on second and third generation adults, as opposed to those that are born in and raised within groups.
I think that's right, and I think it is getting better. And people like Jan Jelalic and others have identified that as being a problem, and so I think more work is being done. But I think this is a historical issue in that most interesting cults came from, I don't know, the 1970s, where there was all these kind of dropout type cults where people get sucked into them, and that's really where a lot of the original research was done, or at least the research drawing on the stuff that Lifton had done with his prisoners of war examples. But again, those were examples of people who were manipulated later in their lives. But yeah, now we've got the children of those groups and the children's children, and I think it for me it's almost like an entirely different realm. It's almost like we shouldn't talk about these two things as if they're the same thing. They're actually so different, because being raised in something, you just you're the way that you are experiencing the world is completely different than if you come into it later in life. So yeah.
So just to finish off, can you please tell everybody listening where they can find What Should I Think About ... with yourself and Celine and and also where they can find your blog. And I will include links to both of these in the episode description as well.
Yes. So What Should I Think About is a podcast that comes out every week. We don't do this seasons thing. We just keep going. And we used to do it twice a week as well, but we found that was just too much. So we tend to do 1 week, we have a discussion with me and Celine, my daughter, and we talk about one of those questions. What should I think about X? So the last one was, what should I think about beliefs? And it was really all about whether we should respect beliefs. Is that something that... now, it's not for us to say, and actually that was more about me trying to work out my own thinking. Because this is not a podcast that is telling people what to think, but it's telling people, or at least it's sharing some of those how to think questions. So and then every other week we also have a guest on who is often an expert in cultic studies or is a personal experience and their story. So yeah, that's the podcast. Normally me and Celine host it. She's more busy than me, so there are times when it is just me, but it's normally me and Celine, and it's better when Celine's there. I absolutely know that. And you can find that on all the podcast apps. I think I've tried to cover as many as possible. Of course, Apple, Spotify, all the others. And the blog is on a platform called Medium, where lots of people do blogging. It's kind of just a big blogging site, and I don't write every week, but I've got a few articles in there, and if you want to read some of that stuff, then yeah, please visit it. I'll give you a link to that as well.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Stephen. I've really enjoyed being able to sit down and chat with you about all of this stuff. Sometimes when I speak to guests on the show, we focus just on the individual's life experiences. And then when people have gone on to have their own platform or create information, then that's usually backed up with research. So then I use that opportunity to ask people for their insights into those things, which you've given us today. You've given us like a really fantastic round view of not only your experiences, but why those experiences as well. And as you said, it's important to explore the entire subject as opposed to just one part of it. I'm sure that we could have talked about blood transfusions or other perhaps shocking parts of the organization that would make for glamorizing headlines. But to understand why those things exist in the first place, you have to talk about the whole thing, which is why these episodes are so nice and lengthy, and we end up getting a nice well-rounded picture. So thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you for your show and for all of the content that you put out, for your research and for your continuation in highlighting these cultic environments. And I appreciate you, and I will speak to you soon, Stephen. Take care.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it.
Bye.
Bye.
That is the end of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram @cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, host of the Cult Vault podcast.
Hey, True Crime Podcast fans! See all your favorite true crime podcasters and personalities this fall at Obsessed Fest. We're talking True Crime Obsessed, Morbid, Damien Eccles of the West Memphis 3, Payne Lindsay, Rabia Chaudhry, and more. There will be panels, meet and greets, live shows, and also drag bingo, and even one epic drag brunch. This is not your typical True Crime Podcast convention. Obsessed Fest is happening September 30th to October 2nd in Columbus, Ohio. Visit obsessedfest.com for info and tickets. That's obsessedfest.com for info and tickets.